Greetings everyone, this is Germane again. As you know, we've been presenting this Journey Through the Galactic Heritage Cards series for you. And as we say each time, we always recommend you watch the series from the first card, from the beginning to now, so that you can have the cumulative effect of the energy and the information. So the last two segments, we were talking about this idea of the transition from third to fourth density and some of the civilizations who experienced that transition before you did, who serve as mentors for you now. Primarily we're speaking of the Pleiades and the Sirius beings. So that was talking about the early transition into fourth density, and at that time we were also calling it second era civilizations. Now, as a civilization begins to transition through the fourth density, which is a long process, remember galactic time is very long, and they begin to approach fifth density, this is also a very significant time for a species. Now, for those of you that don't know or remember what we refer to when we speak of density, we're talking simply about a spectrum of consciousness that represents evolution through the physical plane. And third density represents civilizations that are younger, that are more separated from source, not remembering who they are. Fourth density represents the civilization as it matures and as it begins to remember who it is and how it is connected to the whole one consciousness. Fifth density is the density in which civilizations no longer choose physical incarnation. So we're talking then now in this video today about one of the oldest civilizations that is connected to you, and we're talking specifically about their transition, high fourth density into fifth density. This civilization is the Lyra Civilization. Now, when we talk about Lyra, we have to be clear here. We may have said it in a previous video, but you have a constellation in your sky that you've designated Lyra. However, those stars are much younger than the civilizations we're talking about. The ancient Lyran civilization was much older than those stars. So when we say Lyra, we're talking about civilization in that direction of what you call Lyra now. All right, so there have been previous videos then about the Lyran civilization, and if you want more information, of course, go back and watch those. But simply speaking now, we are picking up the thread of the Lyran story for their third era experience. First era was when they were young, second era was when they were healing, third era now is the era of their awakening. And though the imminent awakening process isn't on the horizon yet for humanity, but you are moving toward it, the Lyran experience is very significant to understand, so that you can, in a sense, create your own roadmap to understand where humanity is going in terms of its own evolution. And also, by understanding the process of your galactic family, you see the bigger picture, you see the whole, and it becomes a much more meaningful and profound story that can bring you great peace if you allow it to. All right, so we're going to talk then about the Lyran civilization in the third era. Because, as you know from the past, they, like the early civilizations, had their challenges and their dramas and their struggles. But eventually, they matured as a civilization and they awakened themselves. So what we're going to do today is examine their process of awakening and also how it relates to you. One of the reasons these cards come up in your readings is to remind you, remember, you are a hologram, so these Lyrans are you in another form. So this is you also, even though it is not necessarily the ego experience you are having on Earth now. In the greater whole, this is still you. Okay, how did the Lyrans transform themselves then? Well, this brings us to card number 67 then. And it is Lyra, future time stream or third era. And the theme is self-observation. This card's theme is a key for any and every developing physical civilization. Because when you have a civilization in third and fourth density, especially lower fourth density, there's a lot of drama, a lot of emotional stuff going on, a lot of distortion in perception. And those distortions create belief systems that you live out, so that the projections you see in your reality, you never become aware are your own projections. You think it is something outside that is happening. So as the Lyran civilization became mature, one of the practices that was the most important for them is the practice of self-observation. What does that mean? Well, it's a state of consciousness that can be developed in which the part of you that is the one, that is watching the experience of separation, begins to become the more dominant consciousness. The egoic consciousness of separation becomes the less dominant consciousness. So, this more dominant observing state of consciousness watches the dramas, the choices, the belief systems, everything that the physical person experiences, watches it with loving, non-judgmental eyes until the ego begins, in a sense, seeing itself enough that it stops fighting the integration process. And it then becomes a champion, if you will, of the integration process. So when you have then the big self, which is the watcher or the one, and you have the little self, which is the egoic consciousness, when these two are existing in more of a third density or lower fourth density reality, sometimes they can be butting heads a little bit. But as consciousness evolves, you begin to see that the greater consciousness starts enveloping the little self, and the heat and the love of that greater consciousness begins, in a sense, melting the boundaries and the restrictions and the chaos of the small self. And eventually, the small self surrenders and lets go. And then the integration process happens. So when we talk about self-observance, then, this is a key in this process. Non-judgmental self-observation. This was the key for the Lyrans. They began to see all their stuff, all their games, all their distortions, basically. And they no longer empowered them. Because when you see them, it becomes very hard to continue to empower them. So this was their key to their liberation. Now, if you've gotten the self-observation card in your reading, of course, yes, it could very well be that there's some Lyran energy helping you, but it's also an invitation for you to begin this process. Can you begin a process of watching the ego from a place of non-judgment? Watching it, knowing it intimately, ultimately befriending it, and then allowing it to open and integrate with the higher consciousness. The process is profound. For some, it can be a long process. For some, it's not so long. But it is an essential process for all awakening consciousness. This is what leads you out of the distorted house of mirrors. This is the only process that does. The development of the clear sight without distortion will lead you back home. This is how the Lyrans did it. Okay. So then we have another card here. We have card number 68. Again, Lyra, third era, future timeline. The theme is generosity. What does this mean? We have to say this is probably one of the enigmatic themes that we have given in the card system. And we'll try to explain this a little bit. Okay? So when you begin observing, when you begin relinquishing the distortion of the separated ego, and the parts begin coming home, what happens? The greater consciousness gets activated more and more, and that greater consciousness is, it sounds superficial, but it is filled with love in a way that is undescribable to the human mind. But as this love begins being, love is not even the right word. If we could find the right word, we would say it, but we'll use love for now. As this love begins blossoming and growing and enveloping the ego, it becomes almost like a flame or a fire that begins to eventually burn away all of the debris the ego carries. When this happens, the love that is given from the big self to the small self can be seen as generous or giving, in the sense that that love, being so natural, has been coming from the universe, your big self, the whole time. The ego never would accept it, always stayed very closed and fighting it. But when the energy comes, giving itself freely, eventually the ego, or the separated self, embraces it. So the generosity idea is, it's interesting because you can look at it from two different ways. From the point of view of the big self, it's the natural energy that you are. But from the point of view of the small self, you have to open and accept the generosity or the abundance from the universe, abundance in the energetic sense. So this card is representing the opening, the doorway, the connection point between what is given and the receiving of what is given. Up until this point, human beings don't yet fully open and receive. And the reason for this is, much of what we said in some of the other cards, is that some of the old karmic belief systems, the keeping yourself tightly protected so that you do not see the distortions you've taken on, the belief systems you've taken on, and certainly not wanting to go into the pain in order to heal it and open So you keep yourself closed, and that's why that connection is not made. So the generosity card then, if you've got it in your reading, again, it could mean a Lyran energy working with you, but also it's an invitation for you to begin to relax the protection a little bit, to relax yourself enough to begin receiving the love of the greater self. Now, if you remember from first era Lyra, the past Lyra cards, there was one card called Protectiveness. And we could say that that card is almost like the opposite of this card. The protectiveness is what we're talking about in terms of the closure. When you're really in third density, you're closed because you need to stay separate. That's part of the prime directive, is to experience separation. So you need to stay separate. You need to protect yourself. But at some point, you have to begin letting go and accept this energy of who you really are. So this is an invitation to begin to soften the shell, to soften the protection, and let it in. Next, number 69, natural humility. Again, this is Lyra, future time stream, third era. What does natural humility mean? Well, we're going to say it's kind of a byproduct of this process of awakening that happens. Because when you have the experience of the ego melting under the love and intensity of the big self, then the ego itself transforms. And the ego has no need or desire to show itself, to say to the universe, look at me, I need attention. Instead, the love of the universe transforms it to such a degree that the ego stops being an attention-getting mechanism, let's say, as it is in third density reality, and it becomes instead simply a mechanism of grounding for a physical species that has no longer any qualities of a black hole, meaning it doesn't seek energy anymore because it is connected with who it really is, and therefore it has all the energy it needs. So to reiterate, third density, separation, you don't feel the connection with the source. So that ego is like a black hole, needing energy, needing energy, needing energy. But as the being evolves and a civilization evolves and it finally allows itself to accept who it really is, and it lets go of the need for control and the need for separation, and it begins melting into the full self, the big self. In that case, then, it doesn't need energy from the outside anymore because it becomes a self-generating system. So the outcome of that, then, we chose the term humility or natural humility, which is simply that you are there in love and do not ever seek energy from others or from the outside anymore. And that is also a sign of an awakened civilization. So if you've gotten that card in your reading, then again, it could mean that there is a Lyran consciousness that is working with you, but also it's an invitation to remember this part of you, because as we said at the beginning, you are all the pieces of your forefathers that we present to you separately, but the hologram itself is you. So there is a part of you that no longer seeks energy from outside. a part of you that is awakened, that is fully connected with that big you. And that part of you is calling you. So if you get this card, reach out, connect with that part of you, and you will see, as you do, the transformation of the ego structure. And finally, we go to number 70 here. Again, it's Lyra, and it is a future time stream, third era. The theme is complete surrender. Does that freak you out? We're making a little joke. Humans, we have found, well, third density humans, have a very hard time letting go, have a very hard time surrendering to the flow of the universe. And this actually is not just a byproduct of humans, it is most civilizations in third density and early fourth density. But as you begin to move into fourth density more, a realization comes for most civilizations that you cannot control reality. That, in a sense, the old ways of operating no longer work. Well, they never worked before, but you fooled yourselves into thinking they worked. But now it becomes very obvious that they don't. So every civilization gets to a point in its evolution where it realizes that it has to move from the energy of the solar plexus, which is the energy of doing, to the energy of the heart, which is the energy of letting go. Third density solar plexus, fourth density heart. In that sense then, this process we were talking about before of the small self, the egoic self, being embraced by the big self or the holographic self, that process cannot continue its metamorphosis, so to speak, unless this one, the little self, the ego, starts to let go, starts to surrender. And so for the ancient Lyrans, they fought it for a while, as most species do. But eventually they knew the only path was to let go. And that letting go transformed their entire civilization, transformed their consciousness in such a way that their eventual awakening and, let's say, ending of the incarnational cycle happened fairly rapidly. So the complete surrender is an essential key for the awakening of any civilization. The paradox is that you can't sit in a chair and will yourself to surrender, because the willing is a doing while the surrendering is a being, so you cannot will a being, so to speak. Therefore, it's an incremental process. Most of you have already begun the process, and we're going to suggest then that if this card has come up in the reading, it's probably quite clearly telling you that it's time to surrender some aspect in your life, some pattern in your life that you have fought with for a while, or that a certain part of you that used to try to push has to now let go. So we leave it to you to know what the exact meaning is if it comes up in your reading. However, it has to do with your awakening process and how at some point all beings come against the wall where they cannot go any further until they let go. But because this is, we're talking about a third era, and your civilization is not yet third era, you don't have to beat yourself up about it right now. It's just showing you the path on the navigational map, so to speak. If you start now with this process of incrementally learning to surrender, to surrender, to surrender, then eventually the transformation itself accelerates and becomes a much easier and smoother transition. All right, so we thank your Lyran forefathers then for being the first to pave the road for your awakening. And of course, there were many others that came after that. All right, as you know, we will have another segment for you soon. We'll give you some time to digest this. And until we meet again, much love.